let's look at the structure of Daniel's book. The structure of Daniel's book is like a sort of a mirror. It mirrors itself, and I've color-coded the chapters so you can see what I'm talking about. It begins with historical prologue. It then moves on to the prophecies to the Gentiles in Aramaic. The Aramaic portion of the book of Daniel is specifically dealing with God's interaction with the Gentile people, specifically through Israel, but God interacting with Gentile government. And so the Aramaic portions have a lot to say to the Gentiles. It begins with a prophecy of a four-Gentile world empire. That was Nebuchadnezzar's first dream. We'll talk about that. So I've labeled that A1. Following on from that, we see God's deliverance of Israel from the Gentiles. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, delivered from the fiery furnace. And then we see God's judgment on a proud Gentile ruler. That's the humiliation of Nebuchadnezzar. So those are three themes that follow on. Now what Daniel does next is he mirrors that and repeats the same thing backwards. The next chapter deals with God's judgment on a proud Gentile ruler, Belshazzar. God's deliverance from Israel from the Gentiles, Daniel's deliverance from the lion's den, and a prophecy of the four Gentile world empire, the prophecy of the four beasts that come out in Daniel's prophecy. So he's doing that specifically. He's mirroring the first three back on top of each other. The second section deals with Israel, because it's written in Hebrew, the language of the Jews. We see the enemies of Israel and God, and the end times and the fate of Israel. And again, in the last two chapters, Daniel mirrors that again, the enemies of Israel and God, the end times and the fate of Israel. The Hebrew section really follows that quite explicitly. It's a parallelism. It deals with the same thing twice. But each time that it looks at the same topic, it gives us a fresh insight into it. And that's the way Hebrew poetry is. If you look at the Psalms or the Proverbs, they say the same thing 3 or 4 times. But each time they're maybe bringing in a different nuance into it. And that's a very Hebrew way of writing and structuring a book. And finally, to mirror at the top, the epilogue is not historical but prophetic. So that's a basic breakdown of the structure inside the book of Daniel, something that's remarkable and something that's repeated throughout a lot of the Hebrew Old Testament. The writers specifically grouping events not so much in strict chronology but in themes, and repeating similar themes but giving us a fresh insight into the theological meanings behind them by repeating the story or repeating an action of God. We see that with the humiliation of Nebuchadnezzar, and we see it with the humiliation of Belshazzar. They both are the same theme, but we get a different aspect of that thing in those two stories. Some of the main themes in the book of Daniel are faith, prayer, pride, the sovereignty of God, and deliverance. I think if you could pick one of the major themes, it would have to be the sovereignty of God, which is a very interesting theme because this book was written at a time when it seemed like there was no sovereignty of God, specifically the God of Israel. It was written at a time when Israel was deported, when the temple would be destroyed, when the monarchy ceased to exist, when the temple offerings were forbidden and ceased to exist. And from a Jewish point of view, it seemed like God had stepped off the throne. Yet it was this time in their history that God sat down in the book of Daniel to teach both Gentiles and Jews the reality that there is someone on the throne and God is sovereign over all things. If you look at chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it." We begin this book with the arrival on the scene of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. But just to step back and to see how we have reached this point, I'll give you just a rapid overview. Moses delivers the children of Israel out of Egypt. He received the law, Mount Sinai. In the law, God specifically says, if you follow me and obey my commandments, I will bless you. If you disobey me and go after false gods and do the things that I forbid you to do, then I will drive you out of the promised land, and you will be subject to the Gentiles, and you will be under bondage. And that's exactly what happens later on in the history of Israel. We see the monarchy. The monarchy in Israel, after Solomon, is divided into two distinct kingdoms, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. It's a time of basically apostasy. In the northern kingdom, it's one king is worse than the next. They end up adopting human sacrifice, idolatry, all the pagan practices that God forbade them to do, they practice. When Daniel was born, he was born maybe 100 years after the northern kingdom was finally destroyed and exiled by a kingdom called the Assyrians. And that happened about 100 years before Daniel was born. As Daniel grew up, Judah, the southern kingdom, still existed, but it was in a very precarious position. The king of Daniel, or king of Judah, when Daniel was a boy, was a king called Josiah, who was a guy that wanted to do right by God. When Daniel was a boy, however, King Josiah made a political decision to support Babylon by attacking Egypt. As Pharaoh Necho brought his troops through Palestine, Josiah attacked him and was defeated. The consequences of that for the young boy Daniel and the rest of Jerusalem were that Pharaoh Necho deposed the son of Josiah and put a new king on the throne, a guy called Jehoiakim. And when Jehoiakim was ruling, Babylon emerged as a very dominant power. And this is where we arrive in the story. It's in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the guy that was put on the throne by Pharaoh Necho, and Nebuchadnezzar comes and besieges it. It was at this time that we're told he does a couple of things. First of all, he takes vessels out of the house of the Lord, so he desecrates the temple, takes the treasures from the temple, takes them to Babylon, and he also takes youths without blemish in verse 4. And that's a very interesting concept. What Nebuchadnezzar is doing is classic counterinsurgency warfare. He is a very sophisticated ruler. He is not trying to simply batter Judah into oblivion, but rather he is attempting to capture their hearts. By doing so, he needs the next generation to be indoctrinated into the Babylonian way of thinking, into the religion, into the cultic practices, and into a Babylonian worldview. To do that would be much more powerful than to just put a battering ram against Jerusalem. Because if you can indoctrinate the next generation into your way of thinking, then you've already won the war. And that's what he's attempting to do when he deports the youths, specifically from the house of Judah. The house of Judah was the royal house. These were the next people that were in line for the throne or for positions in government in Jerusalem. Daniel was sent to university for 3 years, we're told in chapter 1. And while he was there, he was supposed to learn the literature and language of the Babylonians. And for many years, we never knew what that was. But thankfully, a Cork man cracked cuneiform, Edward Hinks, and we were able to translate this language, cuneiform, and we could able to read the textbooks, as you were, that Daniel, the student, would have had to memorize and learn. And it's fascinating when you read them because they're very theological. Very theological. They present a worldview that's radically different to biblical that Daniel would have grown up with. They present a view of a God really that despises humanity. They present man as yearning for immortality but never achieving it. In their great story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero Gilgamesh, he never achieves immortality, even though he spends his whole life looking for it. And so it's a kind of a hopeless religion that focuses on the now. It focuses on pleasing the gods. It focuses on the reality of brute force and in worshipping the gods of Babylon, because by doing that, you can achieve dominance over your neighbors and achieve success. Another interesting thing that Nebuchadnezzar does is he changes the names of the Babylonian youths. Daniel's name, Daniel, God is my judge. All the names, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, the guys that were deported, their names are invoking the God of Israel. The Babylonians changed their names to invoke the gods of Babylon, and this is part of the indoctrination process. They want to forget Yahweh, forget the God of Israel, and become aware of the gods Bel or Venus or Nebo, and in doing that, they can become part of the Babylonian Empire that's emerging.